Hello and welcome to tonight's program. We're going to be getting started at 6:35, and in the meantime, if you'd like to drop in the chat where you're coming from and how you heard about the program, feel free to do so. Thank you so much. Oh, Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to get started in just about 3 minutes. If you'd like to drop in the chat where you're coming from tonight. All right, I see Madison, Wisconsin, nice. And how you heard about tonight's program. We'd love to hear from you. Downingtown, Pennsylvania, Northern California, saw a tweet this morning. Nice. I didn't even send out that tweet. Boston, Georgia, Philly. All right, another fellow Philadelphian. Some of us are here in Philadelphia, but once we do introductions, you'll hear we're kind of all spread out. All right, if you're just joining us now, I'm inviting everyone to drop in the chat where they're coming from tonight. I see Chicago's here, welcome. People from all over the country. We tend to have at least one person from Canada, sometimes Austria. But we're gonna get started in just about 1 minute. And this is actually one of the last programs, Manhattan, Kansas. This is one of the last public programs that we have for our medieval life exhibit, which we'll be telling you more about in just a few moments. All right, great. All right, well, thank you again for being here. My name is Susanna Raminska, and I'm with the Free Libraries Division of Cultural and Civic Engagement, where I am the curator of exhibitions. So I work across our special collections as well as across the city with our 54 locations. And I'm just so pleased to be here tonight with an amazing roundtable. This roundtable is inspired by the Free Library's Medieval Life exhibit, which is available online through the end of this month. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we were not able to open the physical exhibit, but I will be dropping a link in the chat with the online digital assets that you can check out. And I'm gonna actually turn the mic over to Dot Porter, who was our guest curator for this exhibit. And then we'll be introducing the rest of the folks here tonight. Thank you.
Hi there. Excuse me, I'm just going to share my screen. My name is Dot Porter, and I'm the curator for digital research services in the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. And I was invited to curate this exhibition at the Free Library, and it was sort of coming out of several years of work that I've been doing with the Free Library and with many other institutions in Philadelphia. So about 5 years ago now, we received a major grant to digitize medieval manuscripts in Philadelphia. And we did that. We ended up digitizing about 475 codices, which are sort of book-shaped objects, and many more leaves and cuttings, so pages that had been cut out of books and sort of survive on their own. And the exhibition was thought of as sort of a celebration of the end of that project. So we wanted to feature manuscripts held by libraries throughout Philadelphia. There was also a second exhibition at Penn that was curated by my colleague, Nicholas Herman, who is the Sims curator of manuscripts at Penn. And he focused on Renaissance manuscripts. I focused on medieval life. And so this is the topic of the exhibition. What I wanted to do was to create an exhibition that would bring the Middle Ages closer and would give us ways to think about our own lives by looking at medieval objects. And so I did that, and I'm actually really proud of it. As Susanna says, the exhibition was supposed to open at the end of March. And so it did not open at the end of March. It was finally installed in the gallery in August, when we thought that perhaps we'd be able to open for a few months in October. And that didn't happen. So it's been sitting in the gallery. And I have, you can see behind me, I also have some photographs here. And I've been able to go in a few times and see it. Nobody else has been in to see it. Except for people who work in the library. I was able to do a complete video walkthrough, which is going to be going online. So you'll get the sort of virtual experience. And we've also been doing a lot of these discussions with various people about topics that are attached to it. And these are all being recorded and will be made available also later. So there will be a really great record of the exhibition, even if you're not able to go in and see it. So I want to thank all of our panelists, and without further ado, I'm just going to turn it right over to them, and thank you very much.
All right, so I think that might be my cue. So I'm Mary Kate Hurley, and I'm going to be the first in the middle blogger to speak. And first and foremost, I want to thank the Free Library of Philadelphia for inviting the In the Middle bloggers to speak today, and especially to thank Sierra and Nahir for being willing to join us and share their expertise on race in the Middle Ages. Each of the 4 ITM co-bloggers will briefly speak about what a different aspect of what we see the blog doing, and my role will be a short introduction to the history of the blog and its role in medieval studies. So, In the Middle is a group medieval studies blog founded by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who's currently Dean of the Humanities at Arizona State University, formerly at George Washington University. After 15 years and nearly 2,700 posts, In the Middle has long been a center for emerging conversations in medieval studies. And indeed, from the blog's first month, 2 distinctive features emerged. First, it was meant as an open forum. Jeffrey wrote on the 6th post on January 30th, 2006, which feels like several lifetimes ago now, that he hoped, quote, that anyone who would like to post something in this space will feel free to do so, end quote. An open collaboration In the Middle began as it would later continue. In 2006, Eileen Joy would join the blog, as would Karl Steele, who is with us tonight. I would post my first guest post in October 2006 and officially join the team the following year. So within 2 years of beginning the blog, Jeffrey had added 3 co-bloggers. It's worth noting too that Karl and I were both graduate students when we started blogging. It's a measure of the blog's longevity that we're both now tenured professors, but I think that we both would agree that the blog was central to our early academic careers. We would go on to add Jonathan Shu here tonight and Cord Whitaker also here tonight, and Kate Hurley would also join us for a time. We all have different specialties and interests within medieval studies. But throughout our careers at the blog, and no matter how the landscape of academic blogging has changed over the years, In the Middle was always conceived of as an open community. Jeffrey began the blog with a vision of what medieval studies could be, less of a gated academic enclave and more a diverse and inclusive laboratory of academic ideas. As a result, in addition to its main co-bloggers, ITM has always featured a number of guest bloggers writing on all kinds of topics. But the one that has rightly risen to the forefront in the last 5 years is race. And an openness to work on race, medieval and modern, is the second distinctive feature of the blog that emerged quite early on. In Jeffrey's first month, 5 posts were about race, post-colonialism, and related fields. At the time, and frankly still today, unfortunately, the importance of making a space for work on medieval race was important in part because many questioned whether it was anachronistic to work on race in the Middle Ages, whether it was importing a modern idea into a world for which it had no import. In the intervening 15 years, medieval studies has come a long way, as our featured speaker's work shows brilliantly, but it also still has a long way to go. What I've learned through working with ITM and my co-bloggers is that part of redressing the systemic inequities in our field is making space for innovative work to thrive, and that the best way to do that is by passing the mic, so to speak, and making sure that other people's work is heard. If gatekeeping, the tendency of elite spaces in publishing to bar innovative work because it doesn't look like what's been done before, is a symptom of a field that doesn't want to change, then fostering good work that has been kept out is of paramount importance. And as the blog has gradually shifted toward predominantly guest posts in the last few years, that kind of editorial work has come to define what being part of ITM means to me.
Thank you, Mary Kate. I'll take it from here. I'm Cord Whitaker. And back in 2017, shortly after the infamous Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and in hindsight, we know this to be a predecessor to the sort of thing that we saw on January 6th at the US Capitol. But back in 2017, shortly after that watershed event, Dorothy Kim, then professor of medieval literature at Vassar College, now at Brandeis University, submitted to In the Middle an essay titled Teaching Medieval Studies in a Time of White Supremacy. And I'll just share for you briefly here just what it looks like. It was August. My semester had not yet started, and I remained aghast, though not surprised, by the events at Charlottesville. So I volunteered to be the lead editor on this guest post, and that's really how we do it. When someone submits something, we confer amongst ourselves, we decide who'll be the lead editor or editors, and then, we do what we can to it. We decide whether it's fitting for the blog, and then we share it and our comments and ideas with the entire team and go from there. So I noticed right off that this post opens boldly. Kim claims that, quote, medievalists have to understand that the public and our students will see us as potential white supremacists or white supremacist sympathizers because we are medievalists. She then goes on to challenge readers to, quote, choose a side. Doing nothing is choosing a side. Denial is choosing a side. Using the racist dog whistle of we must listen to both sides is choosing a side. By its end, Kim asserts the necessity of an absolute sea change in academic medievalism. She writes, our old style position that objectivist neutrality is where medievalists should be no longer works because it facilitates white supremacists, white nationalists, the KKK, Nazis, and their horrific deployment of the Middle Ages, end quote. Medieval studies and the medievalists who comprise it are, at least in part, at fault for the rise, or really return, to prominence and high visibility of white supremacy, violent white supremacy, in US discourse, politics, and culture. Now, this would not be the last I heard of this essay. It made a splash after we published it. It angered some, even as many also agreed with it and sought to change their syllabi and their styles of teaching and thought about, working on race even if they hadn't before, or thought about where their previous work really intersected with race in ways they had not examined before. But a mere few months later, in February of 2018, I found myself presenting at this panel at the University of Mississippi, The History of the Past, Nostalgia, Myth, and Contemporary American Politics. Professor Kim was also on this panel, and her In the Middle post had been brought up a number of times in the run-up to the event. It came up many times during the event, both in the talks and in the Q&A after talks. And it was mainly brought up by those who were in agreement with its calls to action, by those who were and are still trying to figure out how to best teach medieval studies in a way that recognizes yet also disempowers white supremacist medievalism. but it had also helped inspire white supremacists to levy threats against the conference. The organizers had been sure to hire security for the event, and this is one of few events I've spoken in where the security presence was palpable, was obvious, where I could connect eyes with multiple security personnel guarding the doors. The post was impactful, as was the session, and more broadly, as has been the work of a number of us medievalists who subspecialize in critical medieval race studies, including our honored guests here today, Sierra Lomuto and Nahir Otaño Gracia. But here's the thing about anti-racism. Events like the post's appearance, and even more so the symposium at Mississippi with all its security, appear to be big events. They're occasional, they're splashy, they call attention to their moments, they appear as ruptures in the normal humdrum forward march of time. But what leads to them, what they signal, represent, and encapsulate is in fact much more germane to that humdrum forward march of time. You see, for all that post's impact, it was an ordinary decision to be its lead editor for the reasons I mentioned earlier. It was in the normal course of business to judge whether it was fitting for in the middle, whether it made its points effectively, whether it was too long for a blog post. And indeed, I had sent it back to Professor Kim with a few revisions before we accepted it. At the same time, I was squeezing this process in, right? While I didn't have to teach again just yet, I was deep in the midst of trying to finish my own book on race in the Middle Ages, Black Metaphors, which also takes up white supremacist medievalism. And at the time, I also had a 3-year-old child and a spouse who was in the first year of starting their own communications consulting firm. In short, even though I wasn't as busy as I often am, I was still really, really busy. So I edited most of Dr. Kim's posts, making changes, posting queries, using Word for iPhone at red lights and in parking lots while running errands. A paragraph before getting out of the car at Target, a few lines after getting back in the car outside the post office. I edited the lion's share of it after errands were done while sitting in my car in front of my house. Riveted by the post, yes, but also knowing that as soon as I took the bags inside, there would be at least several hours of other stuff to do before I could get back to that post. So best to finish it and then send it back to its writer now. So in short, it was a completely quotidian affair. It was done as an everyday thing in the normal course of business, tucked in between other everyday normal course of business things. White supremacy and other elements of racism are equally everyday. The psychologist Geraldine Wing Su defines microaggressions, that term that's become increasingly popular in recent years, as brief, quote, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to certain individuals because of their group membership. And Ibram Kendi describes the racism comprised of microaggressions as, quote, a persistent daily low hum of racist abuse. And because racism is an everyday affair, so then is anti-racism. Interpreting Kendi's famed How to Be an Anti-Racist, education journalist Katrina Schwartz writes, quote, becoming anti-racist requires every individual to choose every day to think, act, and advocate for equality, end quote. My anti-racist editorial work, indeed, in the middle, anti-racist editorial work, was completely quotidian because that's what the work of anti-racism is. It's every day. And it's every day, even when it appears to be spectacular, extraordinary, or a rupture in the normal routine. The advertisements for the Medieval Life exhibit at the Free Library, indeed that exhibit's raison d'etre, show us that the manuscripts in the library's collection give us insight into medieval life, medieval daily life. The promotional copy poses that some questions are universal. Is it going to rain tomorrow? Can I afford that? What happens when I die? The weather, financial decisions, it doesn't get more quotidian than that. Even the more spectacular questions about death still permeate our daily lives. So if we are to identify, analyze, and stand against racism, then our anti-racist practice must be equally every day, practiced until it is a way of life. And when we are presented with that which is also everyday, in this case, the everyday lives of medieval people, it's imperative that we question whether and how their everyday lives have impacted our everyday lives. To examine the everyday Middle Ages with an eye to when and how people thought about the globe beyond their homes and haunts, people who spoke differently or looked differently, lived differently, loved differently. This too is anti-racist work, quotidian anti-racist work. And we cannot responsibly strive to understand those medieval people's everyday experience, nor our own, without doing it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Cord. I'd also like to thank the Free Library, the In the Middle co-bloggers, Nahir and Sierra for this conversation today. My name is Jonathan Xu. I am currently here in Washington, DC. I don't live very far from the Capitol. The National Guard is all around town right now, pre-inauguration. So picking up on what Mary Kate and Cord have just said, I do want to stress the importance and urgency of this particular moment we are in. This is a time to think carefully about race and everyday anti-racism in the wake of a deadly fascist riot that put white supremacy on display. Now, anyone who follows in the middle conversations about the Middle Ages knows that the so-called far right has a fascination with the medieval past. It's, to me, unsurprising, and it will be unsurprising to many of our audiences, that medieval iconography was embraced by the writers. Norse and Viking symbols, scale quotes, horns, Game of Thrones style motifs and banners, glorifying toxic chivalry and militant white masculinity. All of this can be summed up in the words of one witness to the mob reported in several media outlets like the Washington Post, saying, quote, "It was some medieval shit." So BIPOC medievalists, including Cord and our guest bloggers at In the Middle, Sierra, as well as Dorothy Kim and Anna Miyashiro, as well as white allies such as Helen Young, have all pointed out on the blog how deep the implications are of medieval iconography and appropriation for white supremacist networks and ideologies, quiet, quotidian, and in their loud and violent formations. As a community, In the Middle advocates for thinking critically about anti-racist endeavors online, in scholarship, and in our teaching. I also happen to have a book coming out on this topic, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Two of the In the Middle blog moments that I think give me a lot of pride and hope are actually a series of posts that are pre-Trump. One in 2014 on racial diversity and medieval Twitter, and one in 2016 launched by Jeffrey Cohen on the impact of queer medievalist Carolyn Dinshaw's essay, Pale Faces. So for those of you who don't know this is a formative essay from 2000 on race, affect, and medieval studies. BIPOC scholars, Dorothy Kim and Wanjun Kao, and along with white allies such as Helen Young and Michelle Warren, all offered an array of inclusive ethical futures in that series that still hold true today. Now, at In the Middle, whether we're talking about religion, culture, race, or language, we're all invested in collectively dislodging these enduring everyday myths of a monochrome, monolithic, monocultural medieval European past. As educators, researchers, or activists, the question that we face is how can we create safe spaces that center those who are most vulnerable, targeted, and marginalized these days? So in our current moment, we're thinking about BIPOC people, Muslims, Jews, queer and trans folk, disabled, contingent workers, the list goes on and on. So in the time of our global pandemic and crisis, I want to stress the vitality of In the Middle and in digital spaces like these, not just during the pandemic, but I hope in the future as well, whenever we're past this, will be a part of an ethos of care. Whether it's basic reality confirmation and coming together to really reaffirm the shared belief that a better world is possible, we can think critically about the medieval past and proactively work together to build hopeful futures. So I hope that reassessing the past, the archives, and our use of those archives can help us build better futures. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. Thanks again for having us. And thanks to Cord and Jonathan and Mary Kate for your talks. It's really inspiring. I've put what I'm speaking about online if it's easier for you to follow along just by reading a text. I'm going to be reading from there myself. So here we go. I'm Karl Steele, by the way. I'm speaking from Brooklyn. I'm going to finish our brief talks by talking about what's at stake in the Middle Ages. Why should this historical period, whatever it is precisely, be so attractive to white supremacy? Why not, for example, the 18th century, the so-called Age of Reason, when capitalism and easy access to oceans and transatlantic slavery all combined to make Europe the tremendously rich worldwide power it remains to this day? Likely because the Middle Ages offers to its fans, to some of them anyway, a past that feels ethnically homogenous and a culture that, to the degree it feels more folkloric than civilized, also feels more demotic, more authentic, and thus more natural than our over-civilized domestic present. It's not just its purported homogeneity then, it's also the Middle Ages' slightly barbaric cast in popular culture that offers itself up to ethnic nationalists as a kind of ancestral homeland. It's a story that we professional medievalists, of course, ought to resist. We can do that, first of all, by using our expertise to point out how these bad fans get things wrong. At least since the 19th century, various white supremacists, organized and otherwise, have seen in the Vikings the originary form of white people, a free and self-reliant warrior band, blonde and blue-eyed, unconstrained by Christianity and any other authority. It's simple enough to tell another story to counter all this. Archaeology tells us that ethnic claims of early medieval people were not biologically preordained, but rather political choices. People claimed as their own the ethnic claims of whatever warlord they served. And ancient cultural practices in Scandinavia, as elsewhere, were heterogeneous, always shifting in interchange with neighboring cultures. Nordic runes, for example, have their origins in the imitation of Roman writing, which means that their origins via Phoenician script are ultimately Semitic. The Norse sagas are themselves nostalgic writing and not at all pan-Scandinavian, as they were produced at a time when Icelandic political independence was collapsing under Norwegian hegemony. It's easy enough to keep going. But knocking down the bad arguments of bad actors feels like a game of whack-a-mole. They just keep coming, we just keep beating them back, and it's hard to imagine anything new coming out of all this. Knocking down those bad stories, however, also requires telling better stories about the Middle Ages. We discover how a period the white nationalists hold up as an era of cultural purity was anything but. Cultural traveled, people traveled. The hagiographic narrative of Barlaam and Josaphat, general throughout Europe, is in effect a Christianized version of the life of the Buddha. In 1306, Ethiopian ambassadors visited Rome, asking their Christian brethren for help against encroaching Muslim armies. About a century later, Rome likewise sent ambassadors to Ethiopia for the same purpose. Arabic lyrics were the key source for lyric poetry in Romance languages, and thus at the heart of what we now know as Romantic love. In the early 14th century, Moses ben Joshua of Narbonne translated Ibn Tufayil's philosophical story of a boy raised in isolation on a desert island, translated from Arabic into Hebrew. The same work, eventually translated into Latin, helped inspire Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. The efflorescence of biblical commentary in the 12th century offers records of theological conversations, not just disputes between Christians and Jewish scholars in northern France, and so on, and so on, and so on. It was not, of course, that the Middle Ages was a time of Iranic syncretism, but neither was it a time of purity, nor one of isolation, no more so than our own era. Our job as medieval scholars should be to tell these complicated stories, because the complicated story is, in fact, the correct one. We should use the material we already have on hand to make room to describe the variety of experience that's already there. And by doing so, help make room too for the variety of people in our field, in our classrooms, in our world. And now I'll turn things over to our featured speakers. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Karl. I think with that, we will go ahead and hear from the first of our featured speakers, and that will be Nahir Otaño Gracia. I will introduce Nahir. Nahir Otaño Gracia is an assistant professor of English at the University of New Mexico. And thanks to a Mellon Fellowship, she's currently a member at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, which is one of my favorite places of all time. And her theoretical frameworks include translation theory and practice, the global North Atlantic, including Britain, Iberia, and Scandinavia, and critical identity studies. Her scholarship has appeared in the journals Comitatus, Eneratio, Literature Compass, English Language Notes, among others. And her current projects include a monograph entitled The Other Faces of Arthur, Medieval Arthurian Texts from the Global North Atlantic, and a co-edited volume entitled Women's Lives, Self-Representation, Reception, and Appropriation in the Middle Ages. We are really quite grateful and just extremely delighted to have Nahir with us today.
Thank you, Cord. First, I would like to thank the library, and Susanna and Dot, and the bloggers from the middle for inviting me to present. I'd like to thank Sierra, whose talk is going to be amazing, so it's good to see her. And I would like to thank everybody in the audience for coming to hear us speak. I would like to start my talk by saying that I am from Puerto Rico, whose original people, the Taínos, experienced cultural genocide and other atrocities. I am at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey, which is the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenape people. And I am also affiliated with the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, land of the Pueblo people. We work and stand on stolen land. And I would like to give you a warning that my talk will be discussing some violent events. And I would like to share my screen with you. Hope you can see it. Today, I am here to discuss how I situate the Middle Ages and its artifacts globally, and how I connect them to the era's social dimensions of race and racism to our contemporary lived experiences. Thinking through the medieval life exhibition and the digital collections of the libraries of Philadelphia. I would like to begin by quoting Shukufer Rajabzaden's talk at the 2020 MLA in Seattle. She discussed how her training as a medievalist helps us to uphold heteronormativity. She said, and I quote, "I have learned how to be a medievalist, in part through programs that refer to education as training. This training, often lauded as rigorous, has been an exacting process that has conditioned me, trained me to understand objectivity as white subjectivity. It was not until recently, and thanks largely to the activism and scholarship of scholars of color and medievalists of color and race before race, that I gave myself the permission to study objects of study like romances from the European Middle Ages as who I am, a Muslim Iranian American woman threatened by Islamophobia," end quote. Our approach to the understanding of the Middle Ages needs to stop pretending that white heteronormative subjectivity is objectivity, and it needs to embrace openly and wholeheartedly BIPOC subjectivity as an astonishing form of research and inquiry. Chukwue's words resonate with me and my own work in medieval studies. But who am I? I am a colonial subject of the United States and a former colonial subject of Spain. I grew up speaking Spanish, and I learned English when I was 12. The Medieval Life exhibition works very hard at trying to connect the Middle Ages to a general audience and to point to ways that our own lived experiences resonate or differ from medieval life. Inspired by this approach, I would like to discuss the colonization of Majorca and the work of Ramon Llull through a discussion of the relationship among border, settler colonialism, and violence. I will elaborate on the conquest, colonization, and literary production of Majorca vis-a-vis the ways that scholars describe or don't describe violence. I do this analysis fully exposing that the dangers and violence of settler colonialism also expose my own experiences of fiddling settler colonial violence. I examine these complex relationships through the theoretical concepts proposed by Terence Andrews and Walter Mignolo. Andrews argues that the Dawes Act and the Doomsday Book show theoretical parallels in the ways that they insist on a settler colonial paradigm. There is not necessarily a direct correlation between the two texts. Instead, they have ideological similarities that ultimately give power to the settler colonial agent. In her case studies, the Anglo-Normans and the US settlers. Drawing from Andrews' argument, I insist that the Catalan literary and record-keeping production parallels settler colonial ideologies. Walter Mignolo gives insights into settler colonial paradigms by exposing how translation, language, and literature were used to support colonization of the indigenous population of the Americas. Mignolo discusses the colonization of space and how European mapping combined with the bureaucratic administration systems became a way to justify colonization. The European and Spanish colonization of space is, and I quote Mignolo, a territorial concept attached to a complex bureaucracies and disguised sources of power that emptied spaces by ignoring previous existing territorialities. European maps in Spanish territorial administration historically became the true representation of a new world and the Indias Occidentales, end quote. When we apply Andrews and Mignolo's perspectives, it becomes evident that the colonization tactics used in the Renaissance and the colonial period had parallels in the medieval. The colonization of Majorca functioned in a similar way by defining and redefining chivalry in connection to Majorca. Several Catalan texts emptied the island of meaning by ignoring previous existing territorialities and mapping new Catalan, Christian, and white territorialities. The colonization of Majorca was a long-term goal that began in 1113 with Pope Pascal II, granting papal privileges to the siege of the Balearic Islands. It was not until 1229, however, that Jaume I was able to conquer Majorca. Jaume continued to conquer the rest of the Balearic Islands. In 1235, he conquered both Menorca and Ibiza. The conquest of Majorca helped define Jaume I as a leader. David Abulafia explains that for Jaume, a Catalan assault on Majorca would not just be a holy war, but also an opportunity to show his unruly vassals in Catalonia that he was a decisive and capable war leader, end quote. I would argue that texts such as Jaume's Libro del Fe de Rei Jaume and Ramon Llull's Blaquerna, among others, turn these events into chivalric art achievements that depict the conquest of the Catalan crown as a chivalric adventures. I would like to step back to point out my point that the siege of Majorca was devastating to the native Muslim population, the majority of which was killed or enslaved by the Catalans. The third option, which was seldom given, which was to choose to convert to Christianity, it didn't happen like it did in other places. These events are intimately tied to the process of colonial expansion, with the result that the native populace was killed, enslaved, and displaced. There were no settler agreements as in Valencia, for example. Soto Company and Mas Foreigners remark that the success of colonization could only be guaranteed by the immigration of Christian settlers in sufficient quantities to replace all or part of the conquered Muslim society, end quote. The devastation brought to the Muslim community of Majorca because of the Catalan siege was so great that the Muslim population of Menorca agreed to recognize the overlordship of the King of Aragon, a decision that saved the population of Menorca from having the same fate as that of Majorca. The acquisition of the Balearic Islands was a violent endeavor that was described as a chivalric knightly one. So the Balearic Islands have been crucial for the creation of a chivalric European cultural imagination. Jaume's account of the conquest of Majorca in the Libro del Fez describes the events as a chivalric adventure par excellence, and Bernat Desclaux and Ramon Muntaner had familiar connections to the islands, and both Bernat Desclaux and Ramon Muntaner are really well-known medieval Catalan writers. Ramon Llull, whose work was an European bestseller, was born in Majorca in 1232 to newly settled Catalans. Luz Libro del Orden de Caballería, for example, was translated into Occitan, French, English, Italian, and Spanish, and was considered a chivalric book for excellence of the Middle Ages. I just want to show you really quickly, if you go to the exhibition, right, the Medieval Life, there's a link to Biblioteca Philadelphiensis. And if you go there and you look up Lul, Ramon Lul, you'll see 4 manuscripts, including one that is about his work. You can see here some of the images from the text. I thought they were pretty neat that you can see these. And this is the manuscript overview. This manuscript contains 2 works by Ramon Lul, one on demonstrating the truth of the Catholic faith and the other a treatise on preaching. And so that becomes really important if you think about Ramon Lul, because his work was about that. It was about showing the Catholic faith as the true faith and believing in preaching. So it's a pretty important, I think. And if you look up Catalan, for example, these are the options that you see. I want to take a second to look at 2 of them. The first one is about the rents and privileges of the canons. And so it's kind of important because actually Catalonia was a record-keeping crown. They had so many records, which becomes so important when you're doing colonization. And the second one is the records of the genealogical investigation of Miguel Ros Palaire in order to prove limpieza de sangre. Limpieza de sangre is also incredibly important when we think about colonization. The idea of limpieza de sangre was very much alive until the 19th century in the Caribbean and Latin America, if not today. So these manuscripts available thanks to the library can tell us a lot about colonization in the Middle Ages and now. By the time that Ramon Lul was growing up in Majorca, the remaining Muslim population was living under a harsh colonial environment. Lul was born in Majorca in 1232 or so, just 3 years after the conquest of Majorca. In his youth, living in Colonia Majorca, about a third of the population was Muslim. By the time he was considered an adult, he boasted that there was an Arabic academy in Majorca in which Franciscan friars were trained in Arabic with the purpose of proselytizing. If you had said Latin America and Franciscan friars trained in indigenous languages, that sentence could do both, right? I've seen several scholarly books argue that Lul grew up among a sizable Muslim population because a third of Majorca was Muslim. But what does this mean? Can we say that a third of the population is a sizable amount when just a few years earlier the whole of the island was Muslim? Whose positionality do we prioritize when we say a third is a sizable population? The colonization, reorganization, and redistribution of the island that emptied it of its previous territoriality was swift, decisive, and violent. Lul grew up in colonial Majorca, and his extensive work, as we have seen, stood out for his theological ideologies of conversion. David Wax convincingly argues that Luz Blaquerna, for example, is a kind of chivalric novel remade in a spiritual missionary key. It substitutes spiritual and theological values for chivalric and courtly ones. Blaquerna's goal is to convert the entire world to Christianity, to lead by example, and to draw the infidel to Christianity through reason, debate, and logic. His crusade comes not only with a sword, but also with an argument, end quote. The text combines chivalry and Christian devotion, a pilgrimage, if you will, with the intent of converting the entire known population of the world Christian. Celia and Lewis points out that crusade and pilgrimage are 2 sides of the same coin. Crusade becomes a literal conquest, while pilgrimage offers a symbolic return. The latter may be a means of individual spiritual conquest, internal rather than geographical or physical, is lasting value measured by the privileged conscience, end quote. The connections between a literal turn to conquest and a symbolic return to conquest become a way to erase the territoriality of Majorca. Lul's focus on conversion rewrites the conquest of Majorca, in which the option of conversion was not granted to most of the Muslim population. Lul's work, and Blaquerna in particular, erased the violent reality of the conquest and colonization of the island of Majorca. I find it striking that Blaquerna, the name of the titular knight in Lul's text, means to whiten. What does it mean to whiten? To bleach away the history of Majorca and erase the violence of colonialism? What does it mean to think about medieval life from the positionality of Majorca? What does it mean to think about the concepts of family, the natural world, labor, law and justice, and religion in medieval life from the position of Majorca? And if you've seen the medieval life exhibition, these are the different areas that you can look at. Understanding Majorca as a Muslim-Christian contact point with a sizable population does not do enough to express the violence that was enacted against Muslims. Understanding crusade and pilgrimage as two ways of erasing previous territorialities through physical and symbolic conquest, a hallmark of settler colonialism, might help us understand the violence hidden in the Christian literary production of Majorca. I would like to return to my point in the beginning of my talk about my positionality and read to you from my essay that the In the Middle blog was so gracious to publish. It's titled On Hidden Scars and the Passive Voice. On September 19, 2017, when we felt the first winds of Hurricane Maria, I was a day shy of turning 37 weeks pregnant. My daughter Enora Maya was born a month after the hurricane on October 18. I sing to her that she came with the waters and the winds, que vino con los vientos y las aguas, y se lo canto al ritmo de Feel Still, de la banda Portugal, the man. That she is strong, patient, and brave because she waited for us to get her and that we had to rescue her. These comments are not exaggerations, but they also downplay everything, just like everything I write here downplays everything. I would like to tell you a memory. I was watching Spike Lee's documentary when the levees broke. The most powerful scene for me was when Lee shows footage after footage of news anchors calling the people of New Orleans refugees. The man and woman interviewed in the documentary expressed pain at being described in this way, because to be a refugee means that you are coming from another country. So months after Hurricane Maria hit my island home, when I finally had internet and electricity and water, and I was able to engage with colleagues and friends from the United States, I was not surprised to hear people calling the thousands of Puerto Ricans leaving the island refugees. I was surprised to see how many academics could, in theoretical terms, discuss Puerto Rico and the traumas of the island, while at the same time forget that I am one of the Puerto Ricans that was living on the island, as if trauma is a theoretical exercise and not a lived experience. In fact, I am certain that most academics do not even realize that I, like other thousands of Puerto Ricans, left my home because I felt I had no choice. Let me make something clear. I am not a refugee. I am displaced. This country in which I reside cannot escape the fact that Puerto Rico was made a colony of the United States, forced Puerto Ricans into citizenship and into every single US war since World War I, and created the conditions of neglect that led to the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. People often speak to me about climate change as if it is in the near future. It is not. I know firsthand what it means to be the victim of climate change, of the greediness of disaster capitalism, and I know firsthand what it means to be dehumanized and rendered invisible. The first month after Hurricane Maria was the hardest month for the island. No electricity, no internet, no phones, no cash, no gas, sometimes no food. We were lucky. We had prepared very well for the hurricane. We followed the national weather forecast instructions on how to prepare for it. We had a generator, but how we were supposed to know it is so much gas, too much gas. We had 2 gallons of water per person. We had a week's worth of canned food. We had gas and cash. But we were not prepared because nothing can prepare you for the damage, for the length of time without help, for the pain our island suffered, a pain that was squeezing me every 10 minutes for that entire month. All the trees were gone, so many houses gone, so many people in need. And then we found out that so many people were also gone. I remember my cousin who had a 1-month-old baby frantically looking for water to be able to give her child formula. There was also no formula in the stores. When you're pregnant and privileged, breastfeeding versus using formula is a debate. But breastfeeding was no longer a choice for me. Fed is best was not a choice for me. Breastfeeding my baby was a matter of survival, end quote. I am displaced because of US imperialism and because I am a colonial subject of the United States. But I am also a settler. Taryn Andrews, in her Introduction to Indigenous Futures and Medieval Past, a special cluster published by English Language Notes, talks about the complications of discussing anti-racism, decolonization, and Indigenous studies in academia. From my positionality, what I hear is that even though I am displaced, I still live on stolen lands, and I am still in a participatory relationship with US settler colonialism. And this to me is the most pervasive aspect of colonization, that it turns us into refugees and migrants and displaces us so that we do the work of colonization for white supremacy. Andrews writes that she wants to articulate the difficulty of colonization that includes both the actual act of returning land and the intellectual work required to navigate the complex structures of settler colonialism and racism that entangle us all. This reminds us that although medieval studies has had a particular contentious and at times openly antagonistic relationship with anti-racism, specifically pre-modern critical race theory and scholars, as medieval studies scholars continue to reimagine a more inclusive future for the field, we might look to the emerging coalitions between indigenous and anti-racist studies for a path forward, end quote. This is the positionality which I choose to take to understand medieval lives, a positionality that is open to coalition and reciprocity, but that is informed by the very real violence that settler colonialism and racism and white supremacy enacts on our lives. We must choose not to erase this reality, but to accept it so that we can learn and heal from it. Thank you.
So I believe I'm introducing the next speaker, who is Sierra Lomuto, who is Assistant Professor of Global Medieval Literatures in the English Department of Rowan University. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2018 and is a former community college student from San Francisco. Her work explores racial formations in medieval literature, focusing in particular on the global relations between Latin Europe and the Mongol Empire. Her research has been published in the scholarly journals Exemplaria and Postmedieval, and the edited collection Rethinking Medieval Margins and Marginality from Routledge. She has also written public essays for various online venues, notably in the Middle, where in 2016 she published an essay, White Nationalism and the Ethics of Medieval Studies. She's been quoted in The New Yorker, The Economist, and most recently, Teen Vogue. The talk she's giving today is slated to be published in a Cambridge volume on medieval travel writing.
Thank you, Karl. Is the sound okay? Okay. This is my first talk over Zoom, so I was a little nervous about the tech. But thank you, Karl, for introducing, and to all of the In the Middle bloggers for putting this together in the Free Library, and Dot Porter, and Nahir for sharing the panel with me, and for that really powerful talk. And you reading your essay too reminded me, and again, listening to all of the bloggers and their introductory remarks really reminded me just how important In the Middle has been to me, and not just as a guest blogger, but as a reader. It is a space where, you know, as a graduate student, and also just in the last couple of years as a postdoc, it is the space that I've been able to go to connect with a deeper level of the field, the heart of the field, maybe, you know, that we don't always see in the objective scholarship that we read. In the Middle has been a place where we get to really tap into our colleagues' real experiences, as Nahir showed. And of course, as Karl mentioned, in 2016, I wrote a blog post for In the Middle on precisely, you know, this issue of white nationalism and medieval studies. And And it was Kate Noreko, actually, who edited that and included that. And I, at the time, was a graduate student without a voice anywhere. So it meant a lot to get that platform that you all have created. And it has opened up a lot of doors for me. So personally, I'm incredibly grateful to In the Middle. And I'm really honored to be here giving this paper. So without further ado, my paper is on race and medieval travel literature, and how we can read medieval travel literature specifically through a critical framework of race. So I'm going to share my screen with you all. Just bear with me for a second. Okay. So racial formations are social constructions or fabrications that emerge through a collective imaginary. Race is a phenomenon with real impact and consequences, as Nahir's talk showed us very clearly. But its crystallization begins where the fantastical meets conditions for materiality. Medieval travel writing captures this very process because of the way that it forged a fantastical perspective about the world and its diverse inhabitants. Medieval travel literature combines ethnography and historiography, usually providing details about the culture and history of the peoples encountered by the traveler, as well as descriptions of geography and landscapes that are traversed. However, these factual topics often hinged on the traveler's experience with biblical and classical legends, marvels, and lore. Medieval travel writing consistently blurs the lines between fantasy and reality, but it nonetheless became common source material for encyclopedic texts and romance literature, and so thereby fueled European knowledge production and popular culture. In other words, it was a mode of writing particularly suited for race making. As some of the bloggers mentioned in their introductory remarks, race is often understood as taking shape through the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism, both capitalist systems that turned particularly skin color into an essentializing feature of human categorization for the justification of violence and genocide. In the same way that these systems have been tied to modernity, so too race has been theorized through the parameters of modern conditions. David Theo Goldberg, for example, has influentially claimed that race is, quote, one of the central conceptual inventions of modernity, end quote. He even delimits shifts in race to the concept of the modern. He writes, quote, the significance of race transforms theoretically and materially as modernity is renewed, refined, and redefined, end quote. To push the concept of race back in time has seemed often to necessitate a simultaneous refashioning of modernity, locating conditions such as capitalism, nationalism, or technological advancements in earlier times, sometimes in nascent forms. For example, as Kim Hall's canonical study of early modern Blackness has shown, a racialized global slave trade emerged as early as the 15th century, with influences reaching even further back. The temporality of race enables an anti-racist logic because locating an origin point and identifying the particular conditions of its invention disentangles it from biology and myths of its naturalness. However, the insistent link between race and modernity, whether in concept or period, has often left us medievalists without a robust critical language with which to analyze the particular formations of race that may not map into modern systems. Excluding race from medievalist scholarship or the Middle Ages from critical race studies not only leaves serious gaps in our knowledge of the medieval past, but also has political implications in our present. We encounter medieval materials through the present of our disciplines, our institutions, ourselves. Even as a modern invention, race holds significance within the phenomenon of the encounter with the past. traveling through time, as through space, displaces the self from a stabilized center, necessitating methods of interpretation. And in the case of medieval travel writing, in which human difference is the core subject, race is a necessary critical framework for understanding how this work participated in creating discourses about non-European peoples. By elucidating the dynamics of race that inform their medieval archives, medievalists can hone a sharper perspective on race for their audiences and for themselves, contributing to anti-racist perspectives in our own time. Literary scholar Geraldine Hang has helped to unmoor race from prerequisites of modernity in medieval contexts. She has furnished medievalists with a definition of race attuned to the particular context of her medieval archives. And in so doing, she has enabled a previously foreclosed critical framework to burgeon in the field. She argues that in the long history of race, difference is essentialized in a variety of ways, perhaps battening on bodies, physiognomy, and somatic attributes in one location, perhaps on social practices, religion, and culture in another, and perhaps a multiplicity of interlocking discourses elsewhere. Hang's intervention invites scholars of medieval travel literature to move beyond a critical framework that positions bodies of color as the object of inquiry, and instead investigate how race operates as a discourse within the texts that constructed those bodies for Latin European consumption. Her theories navigate the structural ways in which race has functioned both within and outside of the institutional codification of human difference, while still insisting on the terminology of race, because it names systemic complexities that would otherwise recede from view. As Hang writes, quote, race is attached to a repeating tendency. It is a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences rather than substantive content. This definition brings critical race studies into medievalist scholarship and the Middle Ages into critical race studies. She reminds us that race is not the material object through which it is made visible, but rather a discursive formation that inscribes meaning into that which is visible. It is, as Stuart Hall has put it, a sliding signifier that belongs to the realm of discourse. As Stuart Hall puts it, its signifiers reference not genetically established facts, but the systems of meaning that have come to be fixed in the classifications of culture. And those meanings have real effects, not because of some truth that inheres in their scientific classification, but because of the will to power and the regime of truth that are instituted in shifting relations of discourse. In other words, race is not the body, but the discourses that render the body and other visible features that mark human difference meaningful within systems of power. The visuality of race follows from the social processes that create it. A way of seeing the body must first be invented rather than taken as self-evident. So discourse and fantasy are two primary issues that inform the investigation of race and medieval travel writing, in my view. When travelers such as John of Plano Carpini, Simon of St. Quentin, or William of Rubric recorded their experiences in various territories of the Mongol Empire, their ethnographic accounts captured the attention of a European audience eager for knowledge about peoples to them unknown. In the case of Plano Carpini and Simon of St. Quentin, ethnographic and historiographic knowledge was a mode of anticipated protection against the potentially threatening Mongol armies. And in the case of Rubric, a desire to convert the Mongols and bring them into the Latin Christian fold motivated his mission. These travel narratives did not reflect overt racial or colonial projects as we may think of them today. However, as Anya Lumba has noted, after Edward Said, nobody could see ethnography as an innocent form. The content of these narratives traveled into and shaped Europe's collective imaginary as well as its knowledge sources. Chroniclers such as Matthew Paris, Vincent of Beauvais, Roger Bacon, they all turned to travel narratives for their source material. From this position, these narratives had enormous impact on the development of Europe's global perspective and the ontological processes that formed deeply entrenched ideologies of race and colonialism, whose legacies we still live with today. So I'm going to turn now to think about a specific travel narrative, the book of John Mandeville. And this narrative is particularly interesting for me because its author didn't actually go on the journey that he says he does. And the narrative he writes is fictional, but he presents it as real. And in fact, his readers received it as real too. And in fact, he actually cuts and pastes a lot of real travel narratives. So reality is threaded in here, but it's a fictional narrative. When thinking about race, it's useful to think about it as a fantasy that becomes reality. Physiognomic differences such as skin color, hair texture, or facial features become tools of racialization within fantasies of superiority. This is a book that's been really helpful to me in thinking through a lot of these issues. Mark Jung's Racial Worldmaking. He describes in this book, he describes race as, quote, a concept with structural potential that organizes our grasping of the world, offering a framework for thinking about the relation between race, geography, and history that is particularly useful in thinking about the imaginative power of travel in medieval literature. Jung writes, quote, the attribution and imagination of race through geographic processes gives the concept of race a durability and repeated applicability that allows it to produce the future, one that people see as inevitable. Medieval travel writing invites us to think about how the global medieval as a concept operates as a method for understanding racial geographies, helping us to see how this discourse organized the world racially, strategically, with the aim of producing power through racial structuring. In other words, travel writing produced space in racial terms. It did not just record difference without a perspective of condescension or without hierarchies. I think that the book of John Mandeville produces a racial geography, a visualization of space that can serve as what Maria Josefina Saldaña Portillo has called, quote, a technology of power. Saldaña Portillo contends that when a racial geography is used as an analytic and theory of spatial production, it indexes the series of techniques used to produce space in racial terms. Visualizing spaces as racial geographies is not just about discussing a manner of seeing. Racial geography theorizes a way of envisioning, of mapping, of accounting for and representing space. In other words, racial geographies not only reveal particular perspectives, but also the implications of spatial representation. This analytic opens interpretive possibilities for reading Mandeville that accounts for the text's politics of geography, highlighting how the traveler narrator's visualization of the world racializes that world and promotes English superiority. The book of John Mandeville offers readers, then and now, a concept of travel that harnesses the purported innocence of cross-cultural curiosity for the purpose of world-making. Racial geographies distribute power and resources in a way that disadvantages some groups while advantaging others based on a centralizing discourse. The narrator, whose name is Sir John, situates India and England within the cosmology of Johannes de Sacrobosco's 13th century astronomical treatise De Sphera, which is dated to around 1230. This treatise is an explanation of Ptolemy's adaptation of Aristotle that was hugely influential throughout the medieval and early modern period as a source for the structures of the cosmos as geocentric. In his cosmological paradigm, the Earth is in the center of the universe with several spheres rotating around it. The location, size, and movement of each sphere were thought to influence the diverse climates and inhabitants of the Earth. Mandeville positions England under the moon and India under the sun. These spatial positions hold racial implications as they impact the way that readers understand the demeanor of the people living in those places. The narrator tells us, he says that the original text is in Middle English, but I've just put some modern English translations up here for ease of reading, of following along. So the narrator says to us, Indians live under a planet that men call Saturn. And this planet turns through the 12 signs in 12 years, while the moon passes through the 12 signs in a month. And because Saturn is so slow in movement, men that live under him and that climate have no desire to move about that much. In our country is the contrary, for we are in a climate that is of the moon and fast movement, for this is the planet of travel. And therefore, it gives us the desire to move about a lot and go to diverse countries of the world, for it passes about the world more quickly than any other planet. End quote. The sphere of Saturn is said to influence the climate of India. And so Saturn's slow speed, determined by how long it takes to circle the Earth, then informs how Indians are constructed. That is, they are constructed as sluggish people who loathe to travel. In contrast, the people of England, like Sir John, live in the climate under the moon's influence. The moon is nimble, and so therefore produces people who love to travel. Sir John uses the authority of the cosmos to make these claims about Indians and English people, and as he does so, he also accords value to these respective qualities. For example, he claims that Indians' aversion to travel has led to their overcrowded cities and towns. And not only is the narrator a traveler, but travel itself is celebrated throughout the book as a morally righteous endeavor. The narrator's use of cosmological and climatological theory here authorizes his own desire to travel into diverse countries as racially determined as something that is essential to English people. Further, within the book's worldview, there is no one more privileged than the traveler. We see this notion reflected clearly when he arrives in Ceylon, which we know today as Sri Lanka, and tells his readers how foreigners are safer than the locals from the land's threatening beasts, and thus may more readily access the wealth of its natural resources. He describes Ceylon, writing in the, this land is mostly uninhabited, for there are so many snakes and dragons and crocodiles that men do not dare to live there. The crocodiles are yellow snakes and have striped backs, and they have 4 feet and short legs and large, incredible claws. And when they move over a sandy path, it looks as though someone has pulled a bush through the sand. The crocodiles are terrifying and monstrous, and their yellow color even visually links them with the Indians, whom Sir John elsewhere also describes with this same word. He says that the people who live near the Indus River, which is also inhabited by terrifying beasts, are of, quote, of evil color, yolaway and grena, yellow and green. In Middle English, evil is a term that means wicked, harmful, miserable, and inferior, all characteristics of demeanor and morality. When used to reference people, it also takes on the meaning of disease. Sir John represents the people of India as morally deficient and dangerous, characteristics that are inscribed on their bodies. Further, the fear that this place induces in the locals is not extended to foreigners passing through. Sir John notes, once every year, the king of that land gives poor men permission to go into the pond in order to gather precious stones for themselves, for there are many. But because of the vermin in the water, these men smear their arms and legs with a special ointment, and then they are not scared of the crocodiles nor serpents. And men say that the snakes and wild beasts of that country never do harm to outsiders who go there, but only to men of that country. For the locals to access the precious stones in the pond, they must first apply their arms and legs with an ointment that will keep the beasts from harming them. But meanwhile, outsiders, strange men, need no such protection. Strange, or stranja in Middle English, means foreign and unfamiliar. But while it can sometimes also mean barbarian, it does not take on that connotation here. Strange men, like the traveler narrator, Sir John, are outsiders who are certainly foreign and unfamiliar, but they are not characterized by the barbarian construct. Sir John maintains a characterization of civility, even as he is marked as strange. His strangeness does not make him vulnerable in this unknown land, but rather serves as the precise antidote to the danger that surrounds him. As a strange man, Sir John can potentially inhabit this land, safe from the threat of the snake-like crocodiles. He can capitalize on his ability to enter the pond, as he can gather its precious stones without fear of being attacked or killed or needing a special ointment, which is released only once a year in order to do so. Ceylon was an important medieval trade location, further evidencing the valence of economic power reflected in this scene. What we see in this scene is a fantasy of a traveler whose strangeness doesn't hurt him, but promotes his access to wealth and resources. And it's a fantasy very much pointing to a future that England will ultimately bring into being. Before race became an institutionally codified formation, it was made within the contours of literary discourse. The intimacy between literature and medieval forms of travel writing blurred the lines between fact and fiction, forging a crucible for making up people. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone for sharing the amazing scholarship that you all are doing. And I know we have about 15 minutes left before we close at 8 o'clock. I'd like to invite all of our attendees to share questions that they might have in the chat, and then we can kind of share that out with the roundtable panelists. And I guess just to get us started, I was struck by so many connections and just the storytelling and the real generous way in which so many of you have shared kind of your lived experiences and the ways in which that informs your scholarship. And it made me think about, you know, the ways in which working in an academic setting, how you all are engaging with some of the same students that come through our gallery spaces on school visits, or maybe now, you know, on sort of like virtual Zooms that we do with school groups. And I wonder if any of you could speak a little bit on sort of like what you're seeing when students enter your classrooms, and sort of how they're looking at this history. What knowledge are they bringing there? And then how are you all working with them to be able to tell their stories in the way that you all have done so beautifully today?
Should I jump in to say I don't have a good answer for that. I will just be on. I mean, I bet Nahir has a really good answer for this. But I'll just start by saying I find it a real struggle. I find it a real struggle to teach medieval materials today. Not only because of, you know, it's difficult to access with the languages, or when you're teaching in translation, it's difficult to teach what that means, and, you know, bringing in translation theory just to be able to, you know, read a story. I find that difficult. But then also, you know, this fall, or in the spring and this fall, the world is upended, and there's so much going on in all of our lives, our students' lives, that how could I ask you to sit down and read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you know, and not, you know, more pressing literature. So I think it is a real task that we have to bring as medievalists, professors. With Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, one of the things that I did is I focused really heavily on that text, on the way that it's framed in the beginning, the myth making of the Arthurian worlds. And that was our entry point. And so it really opened up a lot of discussions about the myth making of whiteness and white supremacy. I mean, that's a text that we don't immediately think of when we think of race in medieval literature. But it was, how do I do that? How do I do that for my students? Because that is something that I think is really important to be thinking about. And we were able to talk about Black Lives Matter, and we were able to talk about, precisely the things that are on their minds right now. And the context of, the 14th century and the Black Death, the plague. So we can make these things relevant, but I do feel like it's a big struggle.
Yeah, yes, Sierra's right. I think, and part of it is because our materials are not created for these kinds of talks. So that means that when we care deeply about these issues, then we have to do everything in some ways from scratch, which is but always, right now it means more work, although I keep telling myself that in the future it will be less work because this benefits everybody and this is the best thing. And so I'm a big believer of preparing students and letting them know that we are going to talk about race and white supremacy and what that means, and doing it from the very beginning of the semester. And when you have a semester, it means that, and you prioritize it, it means that you can prepare your class to have that be the first 2 weeks where you prepare them and create that space for them, so that then they can also bring these things up on their own later. So that's something that I very much try to do a lot, is from the very beginning, take time of all my classes to prepare them that we are going to talk about gender, that we're going to talk about race, that we're going to talk about things that will make them feel uncomfortable, and that's okay, and that this is perfectly fine, and this is how we're going to deal with it, and trying to give them the tools. And I find that doing that helps them later. They end up finding things on their own. So that's something that I do a lot in my classes.
I'd just like to jump in on this too. Thank you, both Sierra and Nahir, for these great talks and for getting this conversation started. And I'd also agree it's very hard. I think another way to think about this is you try to meet students where they are, honestly, and what sort of questions that come up, and kind of follow things that are surprising. So, a lot of us are in English and we teach Chaucer's Wife of Bath, and of course, we'll be talking about gender and domestic violence and rape when we discuss the Wife of Bath now, because it would be unethical to do so. And students, I think, are ready to grapple with those issues given our current climate. I think what's interesting is to kind of pursue things a little bit further and push a little further. The Wife of Bath is somdel deaf. She's somewhat deaf, and that's a shame. Well, guess what? There's a whole field of disability studies scholarship and deaf scholars who have something to say about that. Let's think about that. When the Wife of Bath says she's as loyal as any woman from Denmark unto India, Denmark to India, what does that mean? What's the known world for this medieval British woman? Is India a throwaway concept, or is she actually saying something about Asian women? So I think, those moments that might just seem like little throwaway comments that you just kind of leave to the side, that's actually where you things open up, And this is Cord's comment about kind of the everyday, the quotidian, right? This is a merchant class housewife who's just making this throwaway comment about Indian women. Well, let's put a pin in that. Let's think about that.
I can also just talk a little bit about meeting students where they are, and in my case, getting myself out of what it is I think that I know, or getting myself out of what I do know. So teaching medieval Jewish poetry in facing page translations, Mayor Norwich, who's a 13th century poet who may or may not have lived in England. And I have, at Brooklyn College, I have many students who read Hebrew better than they read English. And so they have had students say with this text, they say, oh, thank goodness, this is actually the easiest thing we have to read this whole semester, because I don't have to struggle to read the English. And let me tell you about the Psalm poetry from the Psalms that he's drawing on, and it's an extraordinary opportunity for me to learn things that I don't know from my students' experience. Or when I taught Ibn Tufayil's Hayy bin Yaqsan, which I teach as often as I can, I had a student come in and give his presentation about how it was heresy. Drawing from his, I said, oh, that's interesting that you called it heretical, because in the 12th century, it was also called heretical. And I'm wondering if you have something in common with these particular Muslim scholars who are, you know, if we had these wonderful conversations, or even just sort of take it out of the moments of kind of cultural heterogeneity. Finding the ways that students connect with these things that are not the way that I connect with them at all. Marjorie Kemp, for example, one of the times I was teaching it was during Lent, and it was actually Ash Wednesday, and a student can come in and said, you know, there are drive-through places where you can get the ashes on your forehead. He's like, he's from Jersey or Queens or something. And he says he's just completely disturbed by that. And what he loves about Marjorie Kemp is how absolutely sincere she is in her faith. And for somebody who is a young Catholic man who is struggling with his faith, reading Marjorie Kemp kind of enlivened his own sense of himself as a Catholic. And I was just like, this is not how I teach it, but this is wonderful. It's wonderful this is happening. So these are some of the things I think can happen when your classroom, when you think of these texts just you're open to the ways that are going to connect with students in ways that you don't expect necessarily.
And if I can jump in too, I'm thinking about that quotidianness that Cord talked about. It's also, you know, letting the students bring it to me, as Karl was saying. You know, I mean, often my students will connect to a text in a way that I can't. And often they'll bring up things that I didn't notice. And sometimes it's the smallest thing in the world, like that throwaway line from Denmark to India. Sometimes it's, you know, this person in this text reminds me of this person in my family. And let me explain to you what that means in my family, because they come from a different familial context than I do. They have a different lived experience. And part of it is approaching both the texts and my students with humility. They know things I can never know. And letting that come to the surface can make these texts come alive for them in ways that I can't anticipate and that I can only just make space for.
Thank you so much. That's just such rich and meaningful sharings, and I'm jumping into the chat here because if we have time to just share out one question from an attendee. Robert Clark writes, love the work you all are doing. It is such a challenge to pry texts and objects out of the discourses in which they are embedded, excuse me, bravo. And maybe one question. In some of the work I did years ago, I was most intrigued by how categories of race cut across categories of class and gender, becoming naturalized in the process. Thoughts? Maybe from someone who hasn't had a chance to share yet?
Well, I'll just harp on my own point about the quotidian, right? You know, this is a great question, you know, and when we're doing critical race studies, of course, it can only be done when you're really also being attentive to matters of class and to, you know, and to matters of gender and to, you know, and to matters of orientation, identity, and so forth. Precisely because, to go back to one of the points Sierra made in her talk about imaginative world making, every single category of identity there is one that has been imagined into being what it is. Right? It's been, you know, what certain bits of evidence mean about class status has been imagined into what it means, or into the way it's represented. This is a really quotidian example. You know, back in the, say, late 90s, when, you know, cafe culture was still a relatively new thing to the US, a lot of people were A lot of Americans were just discovering cappuccinos and espresso outside the context of maybe really fine dining, right? So Starbucks had become a thing, and it spread across the country. And I myself found, really very much enjoyed going to cafes. And pretty soon, I was in college in the late 90s. I couldn't go to class without a mocha. Well, one day, an interlocutor of mine looked at me, it was just sort of an offhand comment, and said, people like you using, how do you put it? Oh yeah, people like you carrying around your cups of class. And I thought, whoa, what is this to mean? And of course, it was a commentary on, spending $4 on a latte, which we all know, if you do multiple times a day, adds up quite quickly, right? The idea of disposable income, even if you don't really have that disposable income, it looks like you have that disposable income. And if it looks like it, what does that say about everything else you're trying to achieve and the image of yourself you're trying to create, whether it's just an image or whether you fully bought into it? So all of that, all of that points to the power that the imagination has in shaping our world, such that which looks concrete, such as gender difference or racial difference, is in fact not concrete at all. And I'll stop there. I could go on, but I'm going to stop there.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. And I think these conversations really need to continue. And I'm really grateful to have the space to start here. And I look forward to seeing what else we can do together. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us tonight and sharing their wisdom and really just teaching us a lot. I'm grateful. And I also want to encourage folks to check out not just the Medieval Life exhibit that's online through the end of the month, but also the materials that are digitized that are so extensive that can be jumping off points for everyone to be able to work on telling their own stories and really continue to connect the dots in the way that In the Middle has done so gracefully and thoughtfully. And I also want to encourage everyone to join us next Tuesday on the 25th for our final program, which will include music, live music. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you again, and we'll see you all soon.